I'd like to call the hearing to order, and I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Today we will hold our first legislative hearing on H.R. 901, a bill that will give regulatory certainty while providing the necessary security to keep chemical facilities, the employees who work there, and the American public safe. Under the leadership of Chairman Emeritus Barton, language authorizing the creation of the Chemicals Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Act, which we know as CFATS, became law during the 109th Congress. CFATS takes a common-sense approach to chemical facility security by allowing the Department of Homeland Security to register facilities and determine where the biggest security threats exist. This is done through the development of a risk-based standards that greatly reduce or eliminate vulnerabilities. To date, this framework has been used successfully with thousands of facilities around the country identified and industry working collaboratively with DHS to comply with regulations. It is important that these efforts move forward because the continuation of the CFATS program remains critical to our national security. Introduced by Vice Chairman Tim Murphy and Ranking Member Gene Green, H.R. 908 will allow our anti-terrorism security efforts at chemical facilities across the country to remain strong and the law underpinning them to remain in effect. At the same time, it gives DHS time to fully implement this law, but most importantly, it provides a signal of clarity to business that they will not face uncertainty, fostering job creation and getting our economy back on track. I'm encouraged by the bipartisan effort with introduction of this bill. It has played no small part in us holding this legislative hearing today, and I look forward to continuing these efforts together. I appreciate Undersecretary Beers for working with us on his schedule to make sure he could testify today, and that's why we're starting a little bit earlier than we normally do. I look forward to an update on the Department's progress as well as its thoughts on CFATS moving forward. Regarding our second panel, CFATS is a law that affects facilities with chemicals, not just chemical facilities. I believe it is important for this committee to hear from some of those interests. DHS's own information shows that some universities, hospitals, warehouses, distributors, and paint manufacturers are considered high-risk sites under CFATS. I welcome these interests and all our members on the second panel. I am equally interested in hearing how the sectors have managed implementation, whether they think major new additions to the law are warranted, and what type of effects an extension of CFATS could have moving forward. Finally, I want to raise one more matter in case there have been many questions. As everyone knows, our committee has sole jurisdiction over the Safe Drinking Water Act and existing drinking water security program at EPA. While I'm not opposed to looking at this issue separately and at a later date, the fact of the matter is CFATS is set to expire very shortly, and the drinking water provisions aren't. In a true risk-based spirit, we are going to attack the problem that is most pressing first, and then later look into seeing whether something more needs to be done in the other area. My time has expired. I'll look for any one of my colleagues who may want a minute and 30, and if not, I will yield back my time and yield to the ranking member, Mr. Green from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the legislative hearing today on H.R. 908, the full implementation of the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Act introduced by Representative Tim Murphy and myself. Chemical facility security is extremely important in the protection of public health and safety, and particularly in our congressional district in Houston. The Houston Ship Channel is the heart of the petrochemical complex that stretches along the Texas Gulf Coast, producing many products essential to modern life. It's also the largest petrochemical complex in the country. These chemical facilities contribute much to our economy and a way of life and employing thousands of workers in high-paying quality jobs. These dedicated employees, as well as the communities that surround these facilities, deserve the best security standards possible to prevent active terrorism on U.S. soil. Section 550 of the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act of 2007, Congress authorized the Department to regulate security at high-risk chemical facilities. Under Section 550, covered facilities must perform security, vulnerability assessments, and implement site security plans containing security. According to DHS, since CFATS became effective in June of 2008, they have analyzed nearly 40,000 facilities across the United States. Initially, DHS identified more than 7,000 facilities as potential high risk. Some, then over 2,000 facilities, have been downgraded or no longer regulated. Currently, CFATS covers 4,744 high-risk facilities nationwide across all 50 states, of which 4,126 facilities are received high-risk determinations. The program is funded through appropriation rider due to expire on March 18th with the CR. It's very important for the security of this country that we revisit this statute to determine what is working in this program and what can be improved upon. Additionally, it's important we provide industry with some assurance that the program will continue to be funded. Since 2001, chemical facilities have already invested billions in security improvements, are fully complying with current regulations. Last year, H.R. 2868, the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Act, introduced by Representative Thompson, Waxman, and Markey, passed out of this committee and the full House. Unfortunately, like many good pieces of legislation the House passes, H.R. 2868 was never taken up by the Senate, and we're here today to begin discussions on how to proceed with chemical security. I worked hard with Ranking Member Waxman and Markey to improve H.R. 2868. One of these provisions was to avoid unnecessary duplication between CFATS and exempted MTSA facilities. I continue to support provisions to avoid overlap with existing security programs. I intend to ask our witnesses today about this issue as well. Again, I want to thank our witnesses for appearing and welcome Undersecretary Beers. And with that, thank you for taking the time to discuss this important program. And, Mr. Chairman, if I have any time left, I'd like to yield our ranking member of the full committee.
You want your full time?
You want your full time? Okay, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the Subcommittee Vice Chairman, Mr. Murphy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and also my colleague, Gene Green of Texas, for working with me on this bill. The chemical industry, we know, touches every segment of our economy, from agriculture to energy production to paints and plastics. Certainly, there's nothing we can go through for an hour in our lives without touching several layers of it, and its safety and security is of high importance to all of us and essential to our nation's economic recovery in maintaining a strong domestic chemical industry. So any federal policy on plant security has to be mindful of that public health and safety, but also has to make sure we have a regulatory certainty, climate, and stability so that chemical employers can continue to safely grow jobs and create a better economy. Under the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, our chemical plants and refineries have made significant improvements towards keeping our communities safe. In fact, since September of 2001, the domestic chemical industry has spent an estimated $8 billion on plant security, and under the existing framework will spend another $8 billion. The law, we know, identifies 4 high-risk categories that require vulnerability assessments and site security plans, but more importantly, the oversight and enforcement of the Department of Homeland Security. By the way, I'm pleased that we're going to be hearing today from a Marine to talk about that, because if anybody can tell us about security, call in the Marines, right? Important, we also have here today information how this is working and present to us any information with regard to its effectiveness and implementation. Certainly, it does not deal with all aspects of chemical safety. That is for other issues on other legislation. This is specifically as it relates to some of these anti-terrorism security measures, and we will look forward to hearing about this. So given that we have a successful program here, instead of changing it, the issue is let's provide domestic employers certainty on the regulatory front so they can continue to work towards these issues of security. Otherwise, we would be creating, I think, more barriers, more confusion with regard to security and jobs. So I look forward to working with Chairman Shimkus and Upton of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and of course with Ranking Member Gene Green, to pass this bipartisan legislation and ensure that a key part of our Homeland Security policy is maintained. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes the Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. After the terrorist attack of 9/11/2001, federal officials and outside experts warned that the nation's drinking water utilities and chemical facilities were vulnerable to terrorist attack. The risk that common useful chemicals could be wielded as weapons by those who would seek to harm us became an alarming possibility and concern. In 2006, the Appropriations Committee established a program to protect the nation's chemical facilities from terrorist attack and other intentional acts. The Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Act was established by a provision tacked on to an appropriations bill. Today's hearing examines H.R. 908, legislation to extend the authorization for this 2006 program for another 7 years. The Department of Homeland Security has made tremendous progress in developing its chemical security program. They have done so without a great deal of congressional guidance. Although the provision establishing the program was within the jurisdiction of this committee, the committee didn't mark up or report the provision. The members of this committee didn't consider and revise it. Unfortunately, it was enacted without our input. The rationale was that this program was an emergency measure. It would be established quickly, but would also end quickly, giving our committee the opportunity to develop a comprehensive policy. The Department of Homeland Security was directed to issue regulations in just 6 months, and the program was slated to expire in 2009. But now we have seen that deadline extended with each appropriations bill. The Department has done well in getting the program off the ground, but it is unable to correct shortcomings in the underlying law authorizing its program. That task falls to us as the Committee of Jurisdiction. And there are serious shortcomings with the law that create dangerous security gaps. For instance, drinking water facilities are not covered at all. Unfortunately, H.R. 908 simply extends the authorization of the existing program and would not address significant security gaps that put Americans at risk. It doesn't have to be this way. In the last Congress, Democratic and Republican staff spent hundreds of hours methodically working through the issues surrounding the CFATS program. We worked with the majority and minority of the Committee on Homeland Security. Industry, labor, and affected stakeholders were consulted throughout the process. The result was H.R. 2868, the Chemical and Water Security Act of 2009, which this committee reported and passed the House on a vote of 230 to 193. That legislation would have closed significant security gaps by establishing a security program for drinking water facilities and wastewater treatment works. The legislation would have harmonized the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Act with the Maritime Transportation Security Act. It also would have removed exemptions from federal facilities. H.R. 2868 would have strengthened security at covered facilities by requiring assessment and, in some cases, adoption of safer chemicals, processes, or technologies to reduce the consequences of a terrorist attack. That common sense policy would help facilities reduce the likelihood that they'll become attractive terrorist targets. H.R. 2868 would also have strengthened security nationwide by creating an important mechanism for citizen enforcement. Companies, state attorneys general, and ordinary citizens could have used this provision to hold the department to deadlines and ensure that the program was implemented. Unfortunately, in its current state, H.R. 908 would make none of these changes and would do nothing to close the significant security gaps we face as a nation. I hope that we can have a robust committee process, find common ground to close those security gaps once and for all and to make our country safer. Finally, I'd like to note a number of issues with this legislation relating to the legislative protocols announced by the majority leader. For instance, legislation authorizing discretionary appropriations is required to specify the actual amount of funds being authorized. H.R. 908 does not do this. The Republican leadership has also said that they require a new or increased authorization to be offset by the termination of an existing authorization of equal or greater size. H.R. 908 does not terminate any existing authorization. As we move forward in the legislative process, it's important that we understand how H.R. 908 comports with these protocols. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding today's hearing. This is an important issue and one that I hope we can work on together. Yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. Now I'd like to recognize the Honorable Rand Beers. I will just say before, we're honored to have you. I've gone through your bio and a career public servant, Marine Rifle Company Commander in Vietnam, and then all over the place working in service to this country. So we do appreciate you coming, and thank you for your service, and you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sir, there is probably a button on the front there.
There we go. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Green, and distinguished members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for working to accommodate our schedules jointly. As you all are aware, Section 550 of the fiscal year 2007 Department of Homeland Security Act, as amended, set up the expiration of this program in October of 2010. And it has been extended through the legislative process, including to this committee, and is set to expire. So we're very eager to work with the committee and all levels of government and the private sector to achieve passage of the legislation and permanently authorize the Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standards Program. While the inspection process is still ongoing, our analysis indicates that this program is delivering tangible results that make our nation more secure. For example, since our inception, there have been 1,246 committees completely removed, having completely removed their chemicals of interest, and an additional 584 facilities that no longer possess the quantity of chemicals of interest that meet the threshold to be considered as high-risk facilities. Currently, as has been indicated, there are 4,744 high-risk facilities nationwide in all 50 states, of which 4,126 facilities have received a final high-risk determination and due dates for the submission of their site security or alternate security plans. This is a reflection of the significant work that has been done to date, beginning with the review, as indicated, of more than 39,000 facilities that submitted initial consequence screenings. More than 4,100 facilities have submitted their site security plans, and in February of 2010, the department began conducting inspections of the final tiered facilities, starting with the highest risk or Tier 1 facilities. The department has completed approximately 175 pre-authorization inspections to date. An important point that I hope does not get lost in these statistics is the open dialogue that DHS has established with industry through this program and the successful security gains that have already been implemented as a result. We enjoy a constructive dialogue with Congress, including members of this committee, as it contemplates new authorizing legislation for the CFATS program. The Department supports permanent authorization for the program, is committed to working with the Congress and other security partners to pass standalone chemical security legislation that includes the permanent authority beginning in fiscal year 2011. As you know, the administration believes that such an authorization should close security gaps in the current structure, such as eliminating the exemption for water and wastewater facilities and prudently approaching mandatory consideration of inherently safer technology. Again, thank you very much for holding this important hearing, and I would be happy to respond to any questions that you might have, Mr. Chairman, and other members of this distinguished committee.
Thank you, sir. I will recognize myself for the first 5 minutes of questioning. So, the last time you were before our committee, you testified that 6,156 facilities fell into one of the top 4 high-risk tiers. Today, on your testimony, you're suggesting that there are 4,744 facilities, or 1,400 around less than before, now fall into one of the top 4 high-risk tiers. I think you mentioned some of that in your opening statement as far as the amount of chemicals being removed, so they fell out of the criteria. Are some of these due also, the decline, is some of it due to plant closings themselves? Do you know?
Sir, I can't give you an exact figure on plant closings, but most of them, almost all of them, are a result of the movement of the chemicals of interest off-site or the reduction in the amount on-site that resulted in the removal of them from the lists of the high-risk tiered.
Your staff could probably check these numbers and get us that information.
We will, sir.
And thank you. Also, Ranking Member Waxman talked about the budgetary aspects, but based upon the President's submission of a budget, there's probably a line item for this program in that budget. Is that not correct?
That is correct, sir. It is approximately $100 million a year. It was 105 in FY10. It was 103 in the FY11 request, and it's 99 million in the FY12 request.
Great,
So
thank you.
roughly 100 million, sir.
Great, that's helpful, thank you. Also, the last time you testified, you stated that you did not have any idea of how much industry was spending to comply with CFATS, but you did note that based on the number of top screen DHS was receiving, that many material modifications were being made by covered facilities. You didn't have last time, do you know of how much industry has had to spend to upgrade to meet CFATS compliance?
Sir, I don't have that number at the tip of my fingertips. Let me have staff.
Is that something, I mean, is that something that in your negotiations they talked to you about at all, or?
One of the considerations that we bring to bear as we develop site security plans is, yes, sir, the cost of those security plans. Security is not a free good, as you well know, and we're very mindful of that. That doesn't mean that everyone has to recognize that some cost may be required to implement a good security plan. But good security plan is good neighborliness on the part of the chemical industries in the areas that their facilities exist.
Are there still implementation issues that need clarifying, such as personal surety or agricultural chemical issues?
Yes, sir. Both of those are still works in progress. The personal surety plan has been a subject of discussion between ourselves and the chemical industry. We are close to being in a position to come forward with that proposal. The extension, the indefinite extension of this regulation applying to some agricultural production facilities remains in effect. We have done several studies, but I can't give you an indication of when we're going to get to the end of that indefinite extension, sir.
And in my opening statement, I mentioned numerous programs from hospitals. This is a wide range portfolio of, and I just want to just put that out just for the public to understand that this does more than just chemical plants. It's a pretty wide range, and of course, from universities to hospitals, or some that we would not normally think would be involved in this program. And in testimony in the last Congress, sometimes that got confused. So I'm just reiterating. You would agree with that? That it's pretty. There are hospitals and universities, and it's a wide range of areas that would involve in the CFATS program.
Yes, sir. I mean, just beyond the chemical manufacturers themselves, this affects warehouse and distributors, oil and gas operations, hospitals, semiconductor manufacturers, paint manufacturers, colleges and universities, some pharmaceuticals, and some parts of the agricultural industry. And then I'm not finished the list there, but that's certainly enough for giving people an indication of how broadly this particular law affects companies and facilities around the country.
Great, sir. Thank you very much. Now I yield back my time and recognize Mr. Green for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some questions on coordination, but let me follow up with that. In your testimony, you talk about the exemption, for example, of water and wastewater facilities. Are there any other facilities that are not part of the law now that you think should be included in it, other than wastewater and water facilities?
Sir, we've talked before, and you mentioned in your opening statement the MITSA exemption, which takes marine facilities or facilities that are located in areas defined as marine areas, which do in fact have chemical facilities that would fall under this regulation if they were not exempted from it. I can report to you that the Secretary has made it very clear, both to me and the Commandant of the Coast Guard, that she wants that harmonized with or without a law. We have engaged over the course of the last year in a working group study. There are 18 recommendations that are now moving up the chain as a result of that committee study, and I'm hopeful that we will have that to the Secretary for final approval in the not-too-distant future.
I appreciate that, and that's one of my concerns is that the MITSA, is part of the Transport Worker Identification Card, and my concern was we would have a separate card for employees who actually go between these facilities. And is it hope that Homeland Security, under current authority, could require or give credit to the TWIC card for someone at a chemical security facility, or vice versa?
Yes, sir. That's exactly the point that the chairman was making when he asked about the personal surety program. And that is an effort that we are trying to merge between the two programs. It certainly defies logic, may I say, if we have one card for one kind of facility and one card for another. Having said that, and having spent some time around the table with a number of members of my staff and other staffs, it's not a simple process, but it is a process which we are committed to and engaged in, and I hope to have, as I said, an answer in the very near future.
Okay. I have 260 TWIC cards issued in our district, and so 260,000, and I would hope that we would have some coordination, because we have plants that are not on the water side, but they're owned by the same company, and yet, they would have the flexibility to transfer those staff between the two. Any other, I'm glad in your testimony you also talked about prudent IST. Under current authorization, does the department have the authority to look at inherently safer technology?
It's not so much an authority question as it is that we have asked our science and technology directorate within the department to do a study of this issue. I don't want to indicate that it is exhaustive, but we in the CFATS area have not, at this point in time, as part of the CFATS program, made any investigatory effort. Should such a requirement be enacted, we are poised to begin that process, but no, sir, we haven't actually begun it.
So is your testimony you don't think you have the authority right now, or you just haven't begun to explore that?
We just haven't begun to explore it. That's why I said we did have the Science and Technology Directorate explore information on that, and that's available to us. At this particular point in time, we didn't feel it was appropriate to move any further than that initial exploratory effort on their part.
Okay. Well, it would seem that if there's an issue, hopefully the department would come to Congress and say this is something we need, and that way we could respond. The exemption of water and wastewater facilities. Last Congress we had legislation that included lots of multiple utility districts that were very small. Of course, some of the largest cities in the country. Is there anything under current law in CFATS that would allow for Homeland Security to also coordinate with our local communities, again, from the smallest to the largest, to deal with some of the chemicals that are stored that makes our drinking water safe?
Sir, as part of our general outreach voluntary program under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, we certainly can talk to those facilities in a best practices sense. But in terms of any formal regulatory authority, obviously we are
Okay.
we have that exemption, and no, we have not had that kind of a discussion in that sense. We have certainly worked with EPA to come to an understanding of the size of the population that we might be talking about. We have coordinated with them about the general notions that would come under a cooperative regime, which we have agreed to should that be enacted. But the actual communications of what a regulatory regime might look like, no, sir, it's a voluntary outreach program at this particular point.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, and Chair now recognizes Mr. Murphy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and again, welcome here, Mr. Pierce. For all practical purpose, CFATS, which took effect in June of 2007, and it's taken DHS 3 years and 10 months to work out the Tier 1 facilities, and I think about 175 preliminary authorization inspections. and 4 formal authorization inspections. How much longer do you think it will take to conclude the preliminary authorizations inspections on the other 41 Tier 1 facilities? Do you have any idea of estimate of that?
Sir, I've told my staff that I expect those to be completed by the end of this calendar year. We have obviously taken more time than you or we would have liked in terms of moving this program forward. But part of the reason that that time has been taken is that, one, we are absolutely committed to a dialogue with industry on this issue, and we are trying to and continue to try to set up a program that is a cooperative program. I think that by and large, if you talk to industry, they will give you a response not dissimilar to what I'm telling you right now. That dialogue has taken time. We have learned a lot on the path from the law's enactment to today, and I have no doubt that we will continue to learn that. But we're definitely committed to getting the Tier 1 facilities done by the end of this year. And as you know, at the beginning of this calendar year, we began a major effort to move this forward.
Thank you. What about the other authorization inspections? Were same thing you feel that?
The other categories?
Yes.
We will move on to them as soon as we get through the pre-authorization inspections of the Tier 1 facilities. So as you note, we've done 175. There are 216 facilities that are in Tier 1 and 3 that are pending final tiering. So we should be able to move through those on the pre-inspection relatively quickly. It's getting the final version of the site security plan and reviewing it and issuing letters that they should begin implementation that's taken up the time. They and we discovered that the original submissions didn't always have a sufficient amount of detail, and that's required a dialogue. We've learned a lot from that dialogue, and I think we can move this program more quickly now based on that information.
Thank you. And you feel industry has been cooperative with you in trying to implement these?
Absolutely been cooperative, sir.
Thank you. When you testified before this committee before, DHS stated that it has not studied the inherently safer technologies' potential effects on employment. Has that taken place since this hearing?
No, sir, not to my knowledge.
Okay. All right. How about, can you explain to me how inherently safer technology works to prevent theft and diversion of chemicals? In any way, is that part of the things that you would have a jurisdiction or would be looking at yourselves?
The simplest explanation of inherently safer technology actually deals with the water issue, as you are well aware. The use of chlorine in water creates a chemical that represents a risk depending upon the volume of the chemical stored at the particular site. There is an alternative which does not require a toxic chemical to be put there and use in that. And the question is whether or not we are going to have movement in that direction. But let me be clear. While there may be 6,000 an estimated 6,000 water and wastewater facilities that might fall under this were it included. We don't have enough firm data to tell you how those would stratify out, and in fact whether they would all in fact be within the regime. As you
Have you been communicating with the EPA on these issues? Are you able to talk
We've
with
been talking with EPA since the last Congress and the bill that this
them?
committee.
Is that a cooperative relationship as well?
Yes, sir, I think it is.
Do we need a federal law to tell you to do that, or you're already? It sounds like you're already doing that, which I appreciate.
No, we don't need a federal law to tell us to do that.
Thank you. Because I know before we passed the Title IV of the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act in 2002, which requires security drinking water facilities, and we're pleased that things are going over and that you're working cooperatively on that. But I see I'm out of time, so thank you so much, sir, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes Ranking Member Full Committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm concerned that this legislation would leave unanswered many questions about our nation's vulnerability to attack on chemical facilities, and I'd like to explore some of these questions with you, Mr. Beers. Is it true that drinking water and wastewater facilities are statutorily exempt from the CFATS program?
Yes, sir.
Are they exempt because there is no risk of a terrorist attack?
Sir, I was not present when the law was originally put forward. I'm not privy to the decision-making process that resulted in the exemption.
Okay. Is it true that nuclear facilities are also statutorily exempt from the CFATS program?
Yes, it is, sir.
Should I rest assured that terrorists will not target these facilities?
No, sir, you should not rest assured that they will not, but we believe that the security regime that the regulatory agency has there is sufficient. Having said that, we have an outreach program between the Department of Homeland Security, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, to talk in a voluntary mode about facilities that are also regulated by another department or agency.
What about the federal facilities that have large stores of chemicals that the department is concerned about, the so-called Appendix 8 chemicals? Are they exempt?
Yes, sir, that's my understanding.
Is there any reason to think that chemicals pose less of a risk when they are at federal facilities than when they are at private facilities?
No, sir, but we have a lot more control over the security at federal facilities than we do without the CFATS program over private sector facilities.
Are you concerned about these gaps created by these exemptions?
Sir, the administration has taken a position which I support, that water and wastewater ought to be included in this regime. We have also undertaken an effort within the Department of Homeland Security, as I indicated earlier, to ensure that there is a common regime between those facilities that are regulated under the MITSA and those facilities that are regulated under CFATS. That committee effort is completed. The recommendations are now moving up the chain to the Secretary to approve that, but she has made very clear to both me and the Commandant of the Coast Guard that she expects a harmonious regime across these two areas.
There are gaps, and you express concern about them. You think they're otherwise being addressed, but would H.R. 908 address those gaps?
H.R. 908 focuses on the authorization, the permanent authorization. Sir, we also need the permanent authorization. The fact that we are living from year to year or CR to CR is not a particularly good way for us to run a program and work with our partners in the industry if we're uncertain about the future of it. You
Uncertain about the future of a CR?
Excuse me?
Are you uncertain about the future of a CR?
Sir, a CR has an end date. If the next act with respect to this year's appropriations doesn't address this issue, yes, sir, I am. I can
understand that. I was being a little facetious in my question to you. We've only touched upon some of the significant security gaps. As you know, port facilities are not held to the same security standards as chemical facilities, even though they may pose the same risk. And I hope that this subcommittee is able to work together to address those security deficiencies and craft legislation to secure our nation. It's been almost 10 years since the attacks of 9/11, but the job of securing our country's vulnerable assets is still unfinished, and I'm concerned that DHS continues to miss milestones for implementation of this important program. Mr. Beers, how many facilities have completed the CFATS process?
Sir, in terms of the final approval of a plan, no facilities have. We have 175 that have received authorization letters, and we have inspected. That means that they go forward implementing their site security plan so that we can then go out and look at the implementation of the site security plan. We have 4 of those 175 who have had an inspection after they have begun to implement those plans, and we expect that those 4 which are currently under review will be finally approved in the not-too-distant future.
Well, let me just say, because I only have a few seconds left, it's been almost 4 years since the Department's rules took effect, and not one facility has completed the process. With that success rate, I think we should all have concern about simply rubber stamping this program for another 7 years. And I just want to put that issue on the table. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. And before I recognize will be Mr. Ladd. I want to recognize Mr. Murphy for a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Request for 2 letters to, with unanimous consent to submit. One is a letter from the CEO, Randy Dirth of Lanxess, and the other one is from the American Chemistry Council.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Ladd, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Undersecretary, thanks very much for being with us today. If I could just go back, I just want to, on your page 3 of your testimony, you're dealing on the very bottom of the paragraph there, talking about, which lists about 322 chemicals of interest. And I think there was a question that was asked mainly on agriculture. I think that the chairman had mentioned. Did I understand you say there was an indefinite suspension on agriculture? What was that again, please?
Sir, there are, because of the use of fertilizer in the agricultural industry, quantities of that fertilizer that are stored on farms as well as at the wholesale distributor. That represented a large problem that we recognized but were not prepared in the initial effort to try to get at the what we regard at the heart as the heart of the problem, which are these larger facilities. So we gave them an extension. We have conducted some studies, but we are not to the point that we're prepared to talk about rulemaking with respect to those facilities.
Well, thank you very much, because the reason is I represent kind of an interesting district. I represent one of the largest manufacturing districts in Ohio, and I represent the largest agricultural district, because, of course, with anhydrous ammonia, that's one of the ones that our farmers are out there using all the time. And then another chemical that's also listed is propane, because out in my area we have a lot of folks that live in the country that use propane for their main source of heat. Now, would propane be another one of those that down the road there might be something that, because again, this is something that folks back home rely on all the time.
It's on the list, is it? Excuse me? Right, okay, that's, sir, with respect to that, yes, it is, but we're talking about levels of propane, not the fact of propane. And, sir, I'm not a farmer, and I don't know how much propane in a rural setting a farmer might have on his site, but I do have some rural property, and I don't have that many propane tanks.
Okay. Well, mainly it's it's mainly for folks that live, and even in small villages, they don't have natural gas. They use, propane tanks that are there to heat their homes and all. So I just wanted to double check that with you. And I guess there's also the other question that I have is, when you're looking at the release and the theft and the diversion, the sabotage and contamination. So down the road, would you be looking at that then, or because again on release, again of course farmers out there when you're spraying with anhydrous, I guess that's my question, is that would somebody who would be in agricultural production fall under these regulations and put kind of an undue hardship on them?
Sir, that's part of the issue that we're working our way through. I mean, the point here is that those 4 issues that you just read out are all considerations, but we have the authority to make judgments on how to or what to interpret on that. There is a level of storage that we look at, but it's also a question of where it is and what kind of a potential threat it is. So
Thank you.
we take all those issues into consideration.
Thank you.
This
Thank
is
you very
not a
much.
mechanistically implemented regulatory regime.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you very much.
If the gentleman would yield just your last 50 seconds for me, it's like I represent parts of 30 counties in southern Illinois, so this little propane debate's an interesting one. These residential tanks are about the size of the pickup truck, the bed of a pickup truck. If you were doing a development in a rural area where you had 10 or 15 homes all with that based upon the footprint of this development, could they fall into this process?
Sir, I don't believe they could. I can give you a precise.
Yeah, I guess the issue is how much.
answer, But this is the issue of how much.
How much
Too much.
over, right.
And that particular.
That might be a good thing, because, I mean, it does, we'll have an agricultural perspective always through this process.
So the three, my staff has
Good.
given me a prompt. 60,000 pounds
Okay,
is the threshold screening quantity.
right.
So, while
I'll
I
find out
can't
how many
lift
pounds
the
are in one of those big
propane
tanks.
tank out back of my rural property without a dolly of some sort,
Right.
even the larger tanks that you're talking about are.
Well, yeah, and we'll follow up. That's what we have hearings for. So, thank you, sir. Now, the chair would like to recognize Mr. Barrow for no questions. The chair now recognizes Mr., no, he's not here. Ms. Morris Rogers for 5 minutes. No questions. Mr. Cassidy for 5 minutes.
Now, Mr. Waxman's question implied that NRC is doing an inadequate job of
Would the gentleman yield for a second and hit your button again? Well, and then pull the microphone up.
NRC is doing a poor job of regulating the security at nuclear power plants. When I visited the one in my district, 6 or 8 months ago, I was impressed with the perimeter fences, the 50 caliber guns, the check-in process, the et cetera. Have you had a chance to review the security requirements for such facilities, and would you accept the implication of his questioning that there is a inadequacy of those?
Sir, as I said in answer to his question, we believe that the regulatory regime that those plants are currently under is adequate to ensure their protection.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that was isolated, that was documented. Secondly, I don't have your expertise, totally upfront about that. But it seems like if we have incompletely implemented the rules, doing a great job, working at it, but it just takes time, incompletely implemented the rules of something passed in 2007, it seems almost counterproductive to implement a whole nother regulatory regime when people have to adjust midstream. That's just intuitive to me. Would you accept that, or would you dispute that?
Sir, you point out a challenge that would be true if that were the case, but the administration put forward its recommendation to add water and wastewater in the belief that we, in fact, had learned a great deal.
But just not to be rude, but water and wastewater were not previously included, so that would not be a regulatory regime change, if you will. That would be an addendum.
Yes, sir.
That's different from saying, oh, listen, guys, you've been working on this, but by the way, we now have another set of rules before you've completed the first set.
I'm sorry, you're specifically referring to the inherently safer technology.
Correct.
This issue. Sir, that is why in the administration's presentation of this possible expansion, that we want to be very clear that the deadlines, if any, take into account the need in moving in that direction that would be required by moving into an area that we would have to spend some time and effort.
But again, just to drill down on my question, it seems like if someone has not completely incorporated the recommendations of rules issued and regulations issued dating back to 2007, to come up with another regulatory regime before you finish the first is almost like a whipsaw. And frankly, somewhat wasteful of resources if it turns out IST takes you in another direction.
Sir, we put forward the recommendation on this in the belief that we could, given sufficient time, be able to deal with an expansion of the regime.
Now,
The challenge that you put forward is I think, an accurately characterized challenge.
Okay.
I'm not disagreeing with you on that, and that's why we've been very clear that we would not want to be held to a heroic set of deadlines in that regard, because it will require an expanded effort. It will require some new information.
Well, again, you have so much more expertise in this area than I. With trepidation, I go forward. But still, when I think of IST, I think that that's a fairly static concept. Now, it has to be, one, vetted. You have to have public comments. You've got to look at it. When, frankly, there may be some innovation out there which doesn't have time to be processed. I think of the Maginot Line as being the IST of its day. And yet, clearly, tank warfare, ruined the concept. Now, do you accept that, or is the Maginot Line a poor example of where we're going with this?
Sir, I'm a military historian. I love your example. But as the process that we have undertaken with respect to the facilities under the current regime has gone from a large number of firms that submitted top screen down to a much smaller number, which is approximately 10%. We have had 1,200 firms that have fallen off of this because they've changed the holdings, and we had another several hundred that are in lower screening. We recognize that this is a dynamic process, and the point that you make about changes in technology, we would, of course, incorporate changes in technology as they occurred.
But is it fair to say that bureaucracies have a difficult time? I'm a physician. Whenever they come up with a practice guideline, I'm always struck that the practice guideline has to ignore that which is on the cusp. Because in order to get the consensus for the practice guideline, the cusp almost has to be marginalized, because 90% of the cusp is marginalized. But there's 10% of that cusp that, wow, is the brave new future. Now, I have to think that in your area that may also be true, as kind of fertile as yours is for innovation.
Sir, that's an excellent example, and I think you're correct in saying that sometimes bureaucracy appears to be slower than reality. But I would also say that one of the things about this program that we have absolutely learned is that we have to be flexible and adaptable in terms of looking at new situations and new pieces of information.
Thank you.
So that's what we would do.
He's gaveling us. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair would like to, with unanimous consent, recognize the ranking member for UC request and then follow up with a statement.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to place into the record both a letter and testimony from the National Petroleum Refiners Association. And
Without objection, so ordered.
also, one last question. Part of the testimony that's going to be submitted by the petroleum refiners, and let me read a little bit of it. Excuse me. Under CFATS, it's required that personnel with access to sensitive information or relevant operations be vetted under the National Terrorism Screening Database, no matter if the person has been vetted by other government credentialing programs such as the Transport Worker Identification Card or the Hazardous Materials Endorsement or a host of other federal government credentialing programs. In the last 2 years, DHS has twice proposed in the Federal Registry that employees at CFAT sites would have to obtain multiple government credentials. Obviously, there's some confusion out there concerning what DHS is doing, and that's our concern about this legislation. One of the things we would like to give you the authority to make sure you streamline it instead of people having, it's bad enough if I work at the Port of Miami and I have to have a Miami port card along with a DHS card or a TWIC card. We surely don't need multiple federal cards. And so that's why that's our concern.
And that's our concern as well, sir, and that's what we're trying to work to resolve.
Okay. Thank you.
I want to thank you for coming and appreciate your response to the questions. And if you got, if we're moving on Mr. Green's issue, we want to be receptive to his concerns. So if there's ways in which you can provide us information as we move forward on this process, we'd appreciate it. So, sir, you're excused, and we'll sit the next panel.
Sir, thank you very much for the opportunity, and look forward to continuing to work with you in the committee. Appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll get everyone a chance to get seated, and then I'll do an introduction of the entire panel, and then we'll recognize each member on the second panel for 5 minutes. Your full statements are submitted for the record, and then we'll follow up with questions. So first of all, we'd like to thank the second panel for joining us. On the second panel, we have Mr. Andrew Skip, President and CEO of Hubbard Hall Incorporated from Waterbury, Connecticut. Also, Mr. David Tarber, I don't know, what's CSP. What's CSP?
Certified Safety Professional.
Oh, I should know that. Global Director of Safety, Sherwin-Williams, I do know that, from Cleveland. Mr. Bill Ullman, Vice President, Government Relations, Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates. And then Mr. James Frederick, Assistant Director of Health, Safety, and the Environment, United Steelworkers. We want to welcome you all here, and we'll start. Mr. Skip, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Green, and subcommittee members. My name is Andrew Skip, and I am president of Hubbard Hall, a chemical distributor based in Waterbury, Connecticut. I'm also chairman of the National Association of Chemical Distributors, NACD, and I am pleased to testify today in support of H.R. 908 to extend DHS's authority to continue the CFATS program. NACD is an association of over 250 chemical distributors who purchase and take title to products and market them to a customer base of more than 750,000. Most NACD members are small, privately owned businesses. The typical member has $26 million in annual sales, 3 facilities, and 28 employees. We demonstrate our commitment to product stewardship through compliance with responsible distribution, our mandatory and third-party verified environmental health, safety, and security program. As owners and managers of our members have a personal stake in safety and security of our employees and companies. We demonstrate this through our commitment to responsible distribution, our relationships with our employees and our union members, and through our careful compliance with numerous environmental, transportation, safety, regulatory concerns both on a federal, state, and local level. On behalf of Hubbard Hall and NACD, I commend Representatives Murphy and Green for introducing the legislation to extend DHS's authority to continue CFATS for 7 years. NACD was a strong supporter of the 2006 legislation that resulted in CFATS. H.R. 908 would allow time for the full implementation and evaluation of CFATS before changes to this important program are considered. Because CFATS is a major regulation based upon performance standards for each facility rather than on one-size-fits-all mandate, it is taking time for DHS to evaluate and inspect over 4,100 site security plans. However, this approach has the advantages of designing plans to address each facility's unique situation while avoiding the creation of a single roadmap for potential terrorists. The bottom line is the real security measures are being implemented at facilities around the nation because of CFATS. For example, my company has 3 facilities that are covered by this program. We have worked hard and spent substantial resources to design our site security plans and implement additional security measures. CFATS is a major regulatory commitment for Hubbard Hall. We are willing to invest the time and resources to comply with this important regulation, and I know that our company and all NACD members would welcome the certainty of a clean, long-term extension. From prior CFATS proposals included measures that would have been counterproductive to the good progress that has been made. The most disruptive of these have required all CFATS-covered facilities, including chemical distributors, to conduct inherently safer technology, IST assessments, and for those in the highest risk tiers to implement these measures. Such a mandate would shift the focus away from the real security issues and force companies to consider full-scale engineering and product changes. I want to emphasize that NACD opposes mandatory IST consideration. The fact of conducting IST assessments would be extremely costly for NACD members and would not reduce risk. For most NACD members, IST assessments would have to be outsourced at significant cost and produce limited options. Chemical distributors maintain specific inventories in order to respond to customer needs. If distributors are required to reduce inventories certain products that would prevent us from meeting these needs. Particularly in these tough economic times, in addition to the myriad of regulations that already affect us, this could be the final straw to put some companies out of business, which would result in further job loss. Required inventory reductions would also transfer additional risk to transportation and increase the likelihood of product handling incidents. Finally, CFATS currently provides incentives to companies to use the safest possible methods so they can assign to a lower risk tier. In fact, over 1,200 facilities have reduced their security risk so much that they have tiered out of the program. Many more facilities have been assigned to lower tiers. In conclusion, I repeat that NACD strongly supports the legislation, extends the current chemical security program with no changes. A clean extension will both provide regulatory certainty and allow for continued progress in implementing real security measures at our facilities. On behalf of Hubbard Hall and NACD, I appreciate this opportunity to present our views on this critical issue, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And I'd like to recognize, and I guess I mispronounced it, Mr. Tabar from Sherwin-Williams. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Shimkus and members of the subcommittee. My name is David Tabor, and I am the Global Director of Safety for the Sherwin-Williams Company, Cleveland, Ohio. I'm also here representing the American Coatings Association. My purpose here today is to support H.R. 908, and I thank you for this opportunity to present our views before the subcommittee today. The paint and coatings industry has been working to enhance the security of their manufacturing operations over the last decade. Specific steps the ACA has taken include the addition of a new security code to our Coatings Care Stewardship Program. ACA is a long-standing participant in the Chemical Sector Coordinating Council and continues to work with the Department of Homeland Security on both voluntary and mandatory security measures under the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism standards. Over the last several years, the coatings industry has worked hard to achieve CFATS compliance, including the submission and the conduct of top screens, security vulnerability assessments, and site security plans, along with development of proposed action plans requiring further review with the DHS. Facilities that were identified as high risk were ultimately assigned one of 4 tiers by DHS. The process is ongoing, and while several coatings industry sites have completed this process, including related DHS inspections, other firms await DHS response to their site security plans or alternative security plans. ACA supported the original CFATS legislation and strongly supports the current program. This demanding program is now requiring thousands of chemical manufacturers and formulators nationwide to develop and deploy meaningful security enhancements. As a result, ACA supports permanent or at least long-term reauthorization of the existing CFATS statute in order to allow regulated facilities to continue their implementation of stringent DHS chemical facility security standards in an orderly manner. In our view, it is premature to seek to change the existing framework substantially until it has been fully implemented and we have gained a better understanding of what works and what does not. It is important that any uncertainty created by possible short-term reauthorizations is eliminated so as to provide regulatory clarity, thus allowing affected industries to make prudent business decisions about how best to implement the current regulations. ACA, along with other groups, has opposed previous efforts to mandate product and process substitutions with technology established by regulation. Any move away from the current risk-based standards would lead to confusion, loss of viable security products, systems, methodologies, and would create prohibitive legal liability and possible business failures. A move away from risk-based standards would most certainly put U.S. manufacturers at a competitive disadvantage, with foreign manufacturers not facing such requirements. By making the existing chemical security framework permanent, a certainty will be provided that is necessary to enable companies to protect our citizens and to facilitate economic recovery. As a result, although ACA has consistently favored permanent CFATS authorization, we support the approach taken in H.R. 908, the full implementation of the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Act. The extension to 2017 provides industry with sufficient breathing room to implement CFATS on a permanent basis prior to a required revisiting of the law 7 years from now. Many operations throughout the coatings industry are covered by CFATS primarily due to commercial grades of raw materials that are commonly used to formulate specialty roof, emissivity, infrastructure, or automotive coatings. As a responsible corporation, Sherwin-Williams has devoted considerable resources to CFATS compliance and works hard to meet our obligations to neighboring communities, customers, shareholders, and the public. Examples of CFATS-related actions include new staff positions in chemical facility anti-terrorism, raw material elimination or substitution, control of purchasing, sales, inventories, development and enhancement of chemical tracking technologies, on-site and program-related consultative reviews, organization-wide safety and security support team development, alternative security plans developed for small facilities, development of internal chemical security compliance standards, development of facility security officer training, develop of new risk and regulatory-based management of change systems to improve risk identification, control, and action closure, and the development of employee security awareness training programs. In light of our own experience, we agree with the position of ACA and our industry colleagues concerning a more permanent reauthorization of CFATS. Because of significant requirements placed on our company and other coatings manufacturers, we believe that Congress should continue to recognize this very stringent and well-constructed industrial anti-terrorism program. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, Chair recognizes Mr. Almond for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Shimkus. Good morning, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Green, and Vice Chairman Murphy, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Bill Allman, and I'm the Vice President of Government Relations at the Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates. For 90 years, SOCMA has been and continues to be the leading trade association representing the batch, custom, and specialty chemical industry. SOCMA's 250 member companies employ more than 100,000 workers across the country and produce some 50,000 products valued at $60 billion annually that help make our standard of living possible. Over 80% of our members are small businesses. I'm pleased to provide this testimony regarding H.R. 908, the full implementation of the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Act. SOCMA strongly supports DHS's current Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, or CFATS. This demanding regulation is now requiring nearly 5,000 chemical facilities nationwide and facilities that use chemicals nationwide to develop and deploy meaningful security enhancements. This performance-based regulation protects facilities against attack without impairing the industry's ability to remain innovative and maintain some of the nation's highest-paying manufacturing jobs. Furthermore, the standards have teeth. DHS has the authority to levy significant fines on a facility for noncompliance, can even shut a facility down. Congress can best assure CFATS's continued success and forward momentum by passing H.R. 908. This bill would reauthorize CFATS through 2017, thus allowing DHS and facilities to concentrate on successfully implementing that regulation through completion. SOCMA regards this regulation thus far as a success. Due to the outstanding cooperation of the chemical sector, there has been 100% compliance with the requirements to submit top screens, security vulnerability assessments, and site security plans. DHS has not yet had to institute a single administrative penalty action to enforce compliance. Additionally, 2,000 facilities have changed processes or inventories in ways that have enabled them to screen out of the program. Thus, as predicted, CFATS is driving facilities to reduce inherent hazards where, in their expert judgment, doing so is in fact safer, does not transfer risk to some other point in the supply chain, and makes economic sense. To fully gauge the effectiveness of the CFATS program, Congress should allow all tiered facilities to come into compliance. Completing the program's implementation from start to finish would provide DHS and chemical companies the ability to assess the overall efficacy of CFATS, identify its areas of strengths and weaknesses, and subsequently make or recommend to Congress any necessary improvements. Conversely, the need for annual reauthorization of CFATS has created uncertainty for regulated facilities. Without the assurance of a long-term authorization of these regulations, companies do run the risk of investing in costly activities today that might not satisfy regulatory standards tomorrow. Statutory authority for CFATS, which has been tied to a series of continuing resolutions passed by Congress since last year, is set to expire next week, as you know. Congress must act now to ensure continuation of the current standards and reauthorize the underlying statute for multiple years. As Congress considers chemical security legislation further, there is an issue of particular concern to us, which is interest among some to mandate inherently safer technology within CFATS. One of our greatest concerns with mandatory IST is the real possibility that it will negatively restrict the production of active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, many of the key raw materials of which are regulated under CFATS. APIs are used to fight many types of cancer, used in prescription and generic drugs and over-the-counter medicines. They are thoroughly regulated by the FDA and must meet demanding quality and purity requirements. Substituting chemicals or processes used for the production of APIs would create substantial unintended consequences. Substitution would likely violate the conditions of companies' FDA approvals. Requiring IST could also delay clinical trials while new replacement chemicals are identified, and meanwhile, to meet continuing consumer demand, API production would likely shift to foreign countries, where FDA is less able to monitor conformance to quality standards. There is a legitimate federal role in IST at the moment, however, and DHS is actually serving that role well. A few years ago, DHS initiated an increasing safety of hazardous chemicals process to develop an expert consensus definition of IST, and from that to begin crafting metrics that would allow people to begin to compare inherent safety of different processes. The definition process was open and engaging and concluded last year with a document that has been universally praised. This program has now begun work on its metrics project, although SOCMA understands that there is no funding for that effort in the President's FY 2012 budget. That is unfortunate because this is an example of how the federal government can play a useful role in the field of inherent safety. Any attempt to mandate even consideration of IST is premature or otherwise. We recommend the subcommittee move forward and place a higher priority on ensuring the current standards are extended. H.R. 908 does just that. I appreciate this opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and now I'd like to turn to Mr. James Frederick, who is from the United Steelworkers. Before I give you your 5 minutes, during the district work period, I visited the U.S. Steel plant in Granite City, Illinois. We still make steel in this country. It's difficult to do. It's the second time I'd been there, but it's phenomenal, a big operation. So thanks to you and the membership for the guide and the tour, and I look forward to hearing your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this morning and discuss the United Steelworkers' views on H.R. 908. The USW appreciates the opportunity to share our views with the subcommittee on the important aspects of this issue and how H.R. 908, if passed, will extend the Department of Homeland Security Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, CFATS. My name is Jim Frederick. I'm a member of the United Steelworkers and the Assistant Director of the union's Health, Safety, and Environment Department in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I've spent my 20-year career identifying and addressing workplace health and safety hazards, responding and investigating to worker deaths, injuries, and illness, assisting local unions with health, safety, and environment improvements, and developing and delivering worker health, safety, environment education and training programs. The full name of our union is the United Steel, Paper and Forestry, Rubber Manufacturing, Energy, Allied Industrial, and Service Workers International Union. As the largest industrial union in North America, we represent a total of 1.2 million active and retired members in the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean. More than 125,000 of these work in 800-plus chemical industry workplaces. Many of these are small workplaces, and some are small businesses. The USW involvement in chemical plant security started long before the original promulgation of CFATS or the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States. Our union has always been actively engaged and involved with our members, communities, regulators, and legislators to improve workplace safety for our members as well as their families and the community. The importance of this issue and these rules were well laid out in the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs hearing yesterday, titled 10 Years After 9/11. As part of a broad coalition of more than 100 organizations, the USW believes that legislation must be passed to improve chemical industry workplace safety and security, not just to extend the existing interim measures that generated the CFATS rule. We believe that this is absolutely necessary to properly protect the communities that our members and their neighbors live and work. Recent examples from the Gulf oil spill to the earthquake and tsunami in Japan resonate of what can happen if catastrophic events take place in this country. And we believe the problems with CFATS include the following. One, specific security measures. CFATS prohibits DHS from requiring any specific security measure. H.R. 908 would extend the prohibition from the DHS Secretary from denying approval for a site security plan based on the presence or absence of a particular measure. The performance-based standards will continue to allow employers to determine how they comply with the rules. Performance standards often result in cost and productivity taking precedence over safety. Performance standards also typically equate in less regulatory oversight. An example of this is sometimes seen in chemical storage areas or tank farms at a chemical plant or oil refinery, where retaining dikes are constructed to keep unexpected releases of chemicals from escaping to the environment beyond the tank farm. However, the retaining dikes are often in disrepair or not engineered to retain the proper volume of chemicals in the tank farm. Next, smart security. CFATS fails to develop the use of smart security, safer and more secure chemical processes that can cost-effectively prevent terrorists from triggering chemical disasters. When we train workers and others to correct health and safety hazards in our workplaces, we train them to follow the hierarchy of controls. The hierarchy of controls instructs us that the most effective way to control a hazard from causing an injury is to eliminate it or substitute it with something less hazardous. Legislation and standards addressing chemical plant security should utilize the same hierarchy principles to recognize and encourage the elimination or reduction of hazardous materials when possible and use substitution with less hazardous components. Safer processes may not be feasible in some circumstances, but there should at least be considered in its security plan. Many safety measures may be possible without expensive redesign and new equipment. Since 1999, more than 500 facilities have used smart security to eliminate risk and create communities that are less vulnerable to harm. 500 is an impressive number, but many, many more need specific guidance from legislation and regulation to implement such changes. Exemptions of too many workplaces at risk. As already discussed this morning, CFATS explicitly exempts thousands of chemical and port facilities, including water treatment facilities, and including at least half of the oil refineries in this country. Worker involvement. CFATS fails to involve workers, knowledgeable workers, in the development of vulnerability assessments and site security plans, or protect employees from excessive background checks. Lesson after lesson can be taken from the input from workers in various workplace health and safety exercises of how that input has helped the employer to integrate and put in place effective security and safety measures. So to sum up, and I'm sorry, one last point on risk shifting. CFATS fails to address the current problem of risk shifting, such as when companies shift chemical hazards to unguarded locations such as rail sidings. Risk shifting takes place continually in many workplaces. There are several reasons that this practice occurs, but the results are always the same. The community is at increased risk of exposure to release of hazardous materials or to a terrorist obtaining these materials. In one recent example at a USW workplace, rail cars of hydrofluoric acid are being stored off-site property on rail sidings. The workplace stores approximately 2 million pounds of hydrofluoric acid, some off-site. Rail cars are located near residential areas in the community. Release from one or more of these would be devastating to the residents close by and for a large area of the surrounding communities. Chemical plant security legislation can fully eliminate risk shifting by banning the practice legislatively and in subsequent regulation. The USW believes that legislation must be passed to improve chemical industry workplace safety and security that includes these items, not just to extend the existing interim measures that generated CFATS as a final rule. We believe that this is absolutely necessary to properly protect communities. However, if CFATS is going to be extended by this bill, please consider reduction of the time for the extension to 1 year and charge all stakeholders involved to convene as necessary to develop longer-term solutions to this problem. On behalf of the USW membership and their communities, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning.
Thank you. Now the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questions. Would you all agree, we've used the word permanent, and I guess in this system of authorization that 7 years would seem like permanent, but Mr. Allman, you mentioned it's really a long-term authorization, and which would then give us a time to look at the bill through the next process. Would you all agree with that, that this is really not a permanent authorization or reauthorization? This is a 7-year authorization. Mr. Skip?
Yes, Yes, I would say that that's true. I think there's a very steep learning curve that's going on here. Certainly, the efforts of the Department of Homeland Security have been admirable about how they've ramped this thing up. And I think we are now finding that we are getting our hands around this thing, but we need more time. And I think this does that. Recognize the fact that rules can change down the way, but this is a great first step.
Mr. Tabor?
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. 7 years is going to go by rather quickly. We've got a lot that we've done in the last several years. We need the next few years to tighten that up. And And we also need the direct involvement with DHS more specifically now that we filed all our plans and are willing to move forward.
Mr. Almond?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. 7 years would provide a lot more time. I mean, Congress actually, has a very important oversight responsibility down the road, but it would give certainly industry a lot more certainty.
Ms. Frederick, you said 1 year, but, so I want you to weigh in also.
Certainly. It already stated as we would recommend a shorter extension. The program has been in place for several years already. Extension only adds to making essentially this into a permanent fix as what was started and agreed to at the time to be a temporary interim quick solution.
But 7 years is not permanent. I mean, it will get, 7 years will come and there'll be another reauthorization period to look at. I guess because the next point, following up on this, is that the full implementation of CFATS hasn't occurred to date. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And anyone disagree with that? No. So the point being, if we had, I think we have to be very, very careful about changing the rules midstream before everyone has completed the process that was designed originally. And so that's part of it. I like what Mr. Murphy's done with the 7 years. That maybe that will be discussed as we move the process through in the committee. Maybe that time frame may be adjusted. I'm not sure how the committee would do in an open process that may come up. But I think it's important that we give the existing authorization time to get through the whole process. We heard the Deputy Secretary talk about they're not even through the process of all the tearing folks out, moving people around. And so that, that's kind of an editorial comment. Do we all, you all believe that there are other existing requirements for health and safety, such as OSHA's Process Safety Management Program, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, the EPA's Risk Management Program, and are these appropriate for safety protections?
Well, they're part of that as far as I'm concerned. And when we implemented all of those things in our community, we're a company that goes back to 1849 in the city of Waterbury. I'm the sixth generation to run the family business. And I can tell you that being thoughtful to our community and make sure we're communicating well with them is something that we do every day. And we integrate that with our police and fire as well. So this would just complement those efforts, I believe.
Yeah, I know both for the coatings industry and with Sherwin-Williams, global process safety is very critical to us. We've made efforts not only here in the U.S., but we're looking at exporting our programs internationally. We think that a lot is embodied in process safety that deals with IST already, and it's very normal for us to deal with substitutions and changes, reformulations as part of our chemical process safety efforts.
Yeah, that's correct, Mr. Chairman. And as the Undersecretary testified, DHS is nowhere near close to understanding how to regulate IST at the moment.
Mr. Frederick?
And it's certainly correct that these are pieces of a very complex issue that do come into play of providing some semblance of safety in those workplaces.
Great, thank you. My time's about expired, so I'll yield to the ranking member, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm just glad to hear you say "you all." I thought that was something that I said.
I'm from Southern Illinois.
I know, Southern Illinois. Well, and y'all heard my questions earlier about coordination between, because I have a lot of plants, in fact, along the Houston Ship Channel. All my refineries, I have 5 refineries. 4 of them are, by the way, organized by steel workers, and thank you. I used to have real steel workers, but now they're all refinery and chemical plant workers. The coordination of that and to where we only have one federal identification card, and that's our goal. And I know for your facilities, it's the same thing. Mr. Frederick, you represent many of the workers at the chemical facilities. In fact, I was last year at a Conoco Chevron facility that actually has 500 steel workers, and that was after the economy cratered. But in some of my plants, chemical plants are closing. But since they make these plastic bottles we all drink out of, they were running 3 shifts and 500 union members. Do you have concerns about the MITSA issues? Because I know that plant's on the ship channel of Houston, and Exxon Mobil refinery and Shell, but they also have facilities that are not covered by MITSA.
Yes, and for a number of reasons, but a couple of very good examples. One is just inconsistencies from within employers from one facility that that is covered by CFATS to a facility that is not, and how they have addressed the facility safety and security as a result of that inconsistency. So certainly, yes, there is a number of examples that we could go into of why we think those should be included in the same set of rules as those off the waterways.
Okay. Mr. Skip, you testified about MITSA facility and potential for duplicative regulation. Under 2868, we would have ensured that facilities under MITSA would see only one regulator, the U.S. Coast Guard. And I would hope, do you think that's important?
I liked what I heard Undersecretary Beers say, which is the harmonizing between those two departments of CFATS and MITSA. And I think that would be great. It all depends on how you define harmonize. As long as there's not a redundancy or duplicative efforts, which I know is a concern of yours, then that I think would be fine.
I guess because when we rolled out the transport worker card, believe me, I had a lot of constituent casework when constituents, because of whatever reason, we had to work case by case through Lockheed, who had the contract. And like I said, we have 260,000 of those, more than that now probably. And we want to make sure that we don't have to go through that again. Don't remake the wheel when you already have some.
Agreed.
Mr. Frederick, I'm interested in your testimony you gave about the concerns of workers and regarding personal security requirements. Are changes in 908 needed to ensure that workers' rights are protected?
Yes, and in one of the examples that is in my written statement, the need for worker involvement in the process of the site security plans is very important. And in order to have thorough and good worker participation, some safety net of protection for them, a whistleblower protection for them, is necessary. And in almost any other instance, we recognize the deficiencies of that, and can see that at some workplaces it's very encouraged. Workers are involved, and at others, for many reasons, it is not. So we're concerned that, yes, there should be some provisions to protect workers as they participate in this process.
And I know in your testimony, I agree with you. And I guess because each of you have, there are other agencies that also regulate these same plant sites, like OSHA. And I, every once in a while, still get to go speak at one of my, what I call SARE committee, that we have a group of industries that bring the community involved, the fence line, and also the employees from there, both unionized and management, and sit down and talk with the constituents. CFATS doesn't take away any of that, exempt that from current law, like, for example, OSHA requirements.
Correct, and in some of that, it's been referred to in the past by DHS as the employers certainly have the ability to do that. So it becomes somewhat of the voluntary piece for employers to do so. The problem is that not all employers volunteer.
Okay, because I think the best way, and having been on both sides of the bargaining table, the best way you get there is you talk to the folks actually producing a product, and you can get the best ideas from them because they're living it every day. One of your exceptions, too, in your testimony, and you use an example of chemical storage and tank farms, particularly with berms. EPA regulates those now, or the state environmental agencies with the deference of EPA, because we have had some problems with those berms that are not updated, and we end up contacting EPA instead of using another law. So there's already some current law that we can deal with on enforcement of those. And again, I know your members are out there every day, and we work with our locals every way we can. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. I know I'd like to talk a little bit more about IST, because having managed the business, we didn't call it inherently safer technology, but believe me, if we could save money and save on potential worker injuries, we use that as a part of our business practice. But thank you for your patience.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Murphy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I appreciate all the panel's comments. It's very helpful. Mr. Tabor, with regard to the American Chemistry Council, how much have members spent overall? Do you have any idea in terms of...
I could answer that, but I'm not a member of the American Chemistry Council.
Well, how about Chairman
American
Williams?
Coatings Association.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I thought you had some knowledge of that, too. How about, Does anybody there know in terms of how much
As far as
companies overall?
ACA goes, I would
Ace-
say that we have not yet collected that data, partly because we're awaiting the direct involvement with DHS on the interpretation of the site security plans and all alternate security plans at the moment.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I would echo that also. That's something that we're waiting to find out more information from our people and how DHS will implement that.
But are you able to share how much your own companies have invested in all of this in terms of compliance or in terms of working
We
towards
have
the security issue?
3 relatively small facilities. It's just around $200,000.
Okay. Mr. Tabor, do you have?
I can state it this way, it will likely be in the huge numbers in terms of the true capital cost. Right now, we aggregate safety, health, environmental, security
Put together.
expenditures, and we're projecting a very large possible impact on the corporation as a function of this regulation.
Mr. Holman, do you have any comments in terms of what's invested in some of these security measures?
Congressman Murphy, I don't have an approximate amount, the tens of millions of dollars, especially when you factor in the staff time, the employee time to actually go through the site security plans. There's a lot of staff time built into complying with this regulation, especially up front.
I see. Mr. Frederick, do you have any idea how many, some of the companies that you work with have invested in working on these issues of security?
We are not privy to that information on
Is it working? Okay, there it goes. Sorry.
we typically don't receive that information from the.
But your workers are engaged in these processes. You talked about the importance of sharing,
In
working
some
together.
cases, yes.
Okay. And how about among the other members here? Do you consider it, or do you include workers in site security reviews and welcome their input? And can you give us some idea of how you use that?
Sure. They participate on our safety committee. All employees do that. It's on a right-to-know basis. It's where their expertise might be able to help in one specific area, but as far as knowing the overall plan per se, they aren't necessarily involved in every aspect of that.
Is
But
that
we-
done for security purposes?
Yes.
Okay. Same with you, Mr. Tabor?
Well, certainly under the OSHA programs, we're one of the leaders, at least in our firm, with voluntary protection programs and OSHA cooperation, and so we take the same perspective with safety and health as we do with security. I think some of the developing areas are the employee security awareness training programs that we're just on the verge of implementing that will take our security awareness and involvement with the all employees to another level.
Mr. Allman, agree?
Well, our organization has a program called Chem Stewards that encourages all of our members to include employees into the decision-making process. I think generally they would agree with Mr. Skip and Mr. Tabor as well.
The reason I'm asking that is Mr. Frederick brings up a point here, and Oliver's saying the companies recognize the people who do this every day have a inherent value in being able to provide that information. And given that, my impressions when I have toured chemical facilities, even ones that maybe have been written up in the newspaper where someone snuck onto the site as part of a reporter's story, they've invested a great deal in taking care of some action and have asked employees for their ideas. Is this something we need to codify into law, or is this something that's being done? Yes, Mr.
It doesn't
Tabor?
need to be codified from my perspective, and I'm sure from our association's perspective, because it is part of good business practice and what we do every day.
I would concur. As Mr. Green said, it's very important to tap into the knowledge of our expertise of our people. We do that every day through lean and other initiatives. That it's just good business sense.
Okay. I appreciate that. We want to make this bill work. We want to have the flexibility for Homeland Security to enact it. We heard before that they felt they're working careful with EPA, and I personally recognize I like it, as when I owned a business, I would ask my employees as well for suggestions along the way. The whole is greater than some of the parts, and getting that information from workers, and goodness knows, I believe with regard to management and employees, everybody wants to have a safe and secure workplace, and I'd certainly encourage the associations to continue to hold those high standards. As usual, I recognize I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Can I make one other comment just
Yes.
about that? I think that you didn't get a lot of big, real clear numbers as far as where things are. We're really looking for certainty, and I think that's what this CFATS bill will do in order for people to invest more. There is some holding back because people are not sure which way to go because they haven't gotten enough feedback yet from the agency.
That's important. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Butterfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to see all of the witnesses today, and thank you very much for your willingness to come forward and to give us your testimonies. Mr. Frederick, let me start with you. In your testimony, I'm told that you said that performance standards often result in cost and productivity taking precedence over safety. Did I quote you correctly?
Yes.
We've seen several examples in the past year alone of major industrial actors placing profits over the safety of their workers and the safety of the environment, notably with the BP oil spill. It's a serious issue, and CFATS should be structured to limit the ability of covered facilities to place too much emphasis on cost at the expense of worker safety or the safety of the surrounding area. Question, can you give an example of these performance standards resulting in cost concerns outweighing the concerns of security?
Yes. Without the specific workplace, but within the industry, within the oil refining industry, some of the performance-based standards. This is the day-to-day case of the performance is achieved on paper, but on the shop floor where the folks are working around the hazardous materials, the shortcuts have been taken. The hole in the fence has been filled with a camera instead of a new fence, whatever the case may be. We could provide some specifics from specific facilities for the record after the hearing if you would like.
Well, what about a specific requirement from DHS to address the problem?
Well, and on that, in some of just the perimeter security issues, the issue has been around fencing. And when a gap in the fence, a hole in the fence has been in place, other measures have been taken instead of putting the more secure fencing in place. The example from the testimony of the berms or dikes to keep the unexpected release of chemicals from a tank is for other compliance with other reasons, but also comes into play as the security, because if there is a terrorist attack on that facility and more than one tank is the materials are released from more than one tank, oftentimes those are not designed to hold back that amount of the quantity of the materials within the tanks.
Well, one thing leads to another. Then we get into a question of whether it's preferable to have a DHS-sponsored security measure requirement that guarantees a level of safety, but may not be flexible enough for the variety of facilities that are tiered, from traditional chemical plants or refineries to labs at our universities. We understand that security isn't cheap and that one size does not fit all. It's a difficult job for DHS. I completely agree with you, with your assessment of the value of workers' input to the process. Workers must be involved, and they must also feel free to blow the whistle without fear of reprisal. This is something we have talked about extensively in previous legislation on this issue. My final question is, do you feel that the current CFATS program adequately protects whistleblowers?
No. We do not believe it does. However, at this juncture, we also have not had cases to cite, only in feedback from our members that work in those facilities, that they have some concerns that they have reservations about raising because there is not an adequate safety net for them to speak out on those issues.
All right. Thank you.
Congressman,
Yes. I'm going to give, yes, you may respond.
may I respond to that?
I have a
also?
minute left. Yes, sure.
I'm Andrew Skip, and I run a chemical company in Connecticut. And I can tell you that 90% of our members are owner-managers of their businesses. Mm-hmm. They live their business day in those facilities. There's nothing more important than the safety and security of those plants. And I can assure you that our members take that very seriously and that they don't compromise for the benefit of just expediency. It is critical. It is our lifeblood. It is our livelihood. And so we take that initiative very seriously. The matter about whistleblowers, I can't refer to that relative to CFATS, but certainly there are laws in place to protect them, and it's something that we take very seriously in our business.
Thank you. All right. Anyone else want to respond to that? I have a few seconds left.
I think the laws that are in place would not, for example, the protections within the OSHA Act would not protect a worker for calling into question something under the CFATS regulations.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back my
If the
time.
gentleman would yield me his last 4 seconds. I just
Sure.
want to make sure, Mr. Frederick, that none of your comments or was under CVI. In other words, anything, the information that you were alluding to is under CVI?
In the example of the,
Well, you were giving some anecdotal stories, and we want to make sure that,
I don't believe so.
Okay.
To my knowledge, no.
well, okay, that's what we need to know. Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Cassidy for 5 minutes.
I never knew Steelworker's name was so long. I once sat on a plane next to a guy who worked for y'all and who was, I think, doing mining, which I thought, so anyway, now the light bulb goes on. Mr. Frederick, there was one sentence in your testimony in which you suggest that you would oppose to more extensive background checks for workers. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, and our concern around background checks is that of twofold. One is to make certain that there is a process in place that if an error results of the background check, that individual has an opportunity to clarify that error and correct it prior to losing his or her employment.
But inherent in, now I accept that, but inherent in having more involvement in a process is greater risk that a background check may show something which would eliminate somebody's job, frankly. I mean, if it turns out a kid smoked marijuana in college and got busted for it, and now he's 45, well, then that may come back and reflect upon him in a negative way. Would you object to, drug screens, et cetera, all this that takes place?
Well, there are drug testing programs in a variety of.
And I just use that as an example, not as a concrete particular. So it's not background checks in particular you object to, or more even exhaustive ones. Rather, it is the lack of safeguards if someone loses employment because of that.
And yes, in recognizing that there are necessary pieces of information that are needed, it is also a very extensive. Our experience thus far has been that this is and will be a very extensive process, expensive and extensive, for a very limited amount of return of finding things more than somebody who perhaps had a minor item such as you.
So if you will, kind of the principle that sometimes for that last marginal benefit, you got to pay a heck of a lot of money.
And in some of the other examples we're talking about, yes, there are costs associated with doing dangerous work.
And if you increase the cost, ultimately it's going to affect employment.
It may, yes.
So my concern is, for example, that same principle is involved here. I mentioned earlier to the earlier witness, I went to visit the nuclear power plant, and I was struck how much security they have. 3 different perimeter fences. Even if they cut a hole, there is a camera surveillance. And so they told me about how an armadillo wandered across, and their motion detectors got it. Now, if we're going to have an NRC do this level of requirement and overlay CFATS, do you see that as appropriate?
Well, specifically to the NRC provision, I don't have firsthand knowledge or experience. Our union does not represent workers at nuclear generators.
But you mentioned that in your testimony as kind of a concern that they're excluded.
The NRC. And so what I want to explain is that within the NRC, they also have a regulatory authority over non-energy producing facilities beyond the nuclear plants. And in some of those facilities, one example being where the NRC has a oversight of a very narrow piece of the production process. It's a very large facility, narrow piece is NRC, but because the NRC has authority over that narrow piece, CFATS does not apply. And so there are, for example, that is the facility that has 2 million pounds of hydrofluoric acid on site and some of it in rail cars off site. That is a very real concern, that the NRC, small piece of the operation that they have oversight for, the large facility excluded from CFATS.
So now my concern is that if we have overlay of federal agency over federal agency, that's not just a multiplier, that's an exponent in terms of the complexity of and the expense of compliance. Now, it also seems this IST, I use the example of the Maginot Line, where you've got this kind of, okay, this is the current technology, but really there's something on the cusp, but it's not been vetted, reviewed, public comment, so therefore it can't be because the de facto standard becomes the IST. that actually seems like a counterproductive mechanism. I don't see the problem. In fact, I see IST as almost the same problem you defined earlier, going after marginal benefit with greater expense, ultimately costing jobs.
In some cases, the using other technologies is certainly not costing jobs. There are many examples of better technologies being brought in place across worker health and safety as well as site security. In some cases, there are other examples that jobs have been affected.
But won't that eventually, if you have IST that becomes the de facto standard, if it becomes a de facto standard, even if there is a better technology, it most likely won't be implemented because there's a de facto standard issued by a reg 8 months ago, even if 1 month ago there's a better technology that comes out.
And however, if it's looked at and with a system in place as suggested in the testimony and in other folks that are looking at this issue currently in other bills, there are the ability to have a DHS appeals process that would ensure that the facility, the employer, has the ability to refer this back with some questions and move on to
Now, I've been in this federal government now for 2.5 years, but it's my impression that it dances like an elephant upon the head of a pin. It is very slow-moving, it is very awkward, it is very laborious and expensive to work through that process. So I kind of return to my point that the reg issued 9 months ago becomes a de facto standard, and 2 years later you finally work through the appeals process, and in the meantime you're 3 generations ahead. What you originally offered on appeal is now outdated. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yes.
And so do you really see the bureaucracy in the appeals process working so well that we'll always have the most current technology being used to secure our plants?
I see that we certainly would have better technology that is in place at the start of the process and the ability for the employer, the manufacturer, to continue to move forward as long as it's within the scope of their security plan.
But if there's a new technology that comes out and it's not part of the IST, what's the likelihood it will be immediately implemented?
Well, and so perhaps I guess we're a little bit off of what we perceive the prescriptive standard on IST to look like. We believe that in the instance in some of the other applications of this issue that are in place, there is the flexibility for
Well, the Assistant Secretary actually, though, conceded the possibility that there would be a standard which would leave out something that would be technologically more advanced because it had not had a chance to be reviewed. And he actually, frankly said, yeah, that's going to happen. He accepted that as a probability. And frankly, that concerns me because I think that there is so much explosion of technology, we would be remiss in terms of safety and all the other things if we didn't have a standard which allowed its usage. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. Did you want to just, would you ask consent for the ranking member for a minute?
I want to ask him your response, Ms. Frederick, to our colleague from Louisiana, that because NRC has jurisdiction over, for example, a nuclear facility, but they don't have jurisdiction over something else on that plant site, that would exempt any other regulation because NRC has it.
Just in this instance that I was referring to, just the CFATS regulation, the CFATS requirements.
We're going to explore that because I know we have OSHA requirements at nuclear facilities. We have a lot of, and we really don't want overlay and duplication, but we do want somebody looking at it.
Correct.
And so that's the concern.
And I thank my colleague. I have a couple pieces of business to finish up. Unanimous consent request that a letter from Mr. Dent on this be submitted for the record. Without objection, so ordered. I also want to advise all members that we have 10 legislative days to submit questions for the record, and if you would be so good to return those questions to us to fill the hearing. No. All right. I think I was right. So with that, we do appreciate your time. Please feel free to visit with us on this issue as we move forward. We do want to bring some certainty to this. We do want to have a longer-term reauthorization of some size so that you all can move forward in helping in this process. So with that, the hearing is adjourned.